So you may be wondering, why should I start a podcast? Well, podcasts are currently the fastest growing medium on all digital platforms. And that's because they can engage listeners in a way that traditional media can't. And this results in a highly loyal, highly targeted, and highly engaged listener. Now, although podcasts have been around since 2004, there's been a recent meteoric rise in the industry, partly due to the coronavirus pandemic. And this rise is here to stay, with the market currently forecasted to reach $41 billion by 2026. So it's definitely a great time to be thinking about starting a podcast. Now, the reason that I decided to start my own podcast was really threefold. The first was to go much deeper into conveying the brand values and vibes that my businesses in music and motorsport stand for. Secondly, it was the opportunity to have the chance to really interview prolific thought leaders in the space and get their opinions on these subject matters. And thirdly, whilst these subject matters of music and motorsport might seem quite unrelated and certainly very niche, there's definitely a red line through the mindset of high performance, which I'm absolutely fascinated by. And there's actually a lot of similarities in that sort of mindset. And I thought a lot of people could take, the sort of resonance from these leaders and apply it into their own lives. And I thought it would make a very fascinating topic of discussion for a show. And that's really the third reason why I decided to start Mission Makers. So I think there's many things that make a podcast different to other forms of media. But of course, one of the first things is that it's really like being a fly on the wall, and you have the opportunity to listen to these conversations and learn from people that you would never normally have access to. And in a way that's much more authentic, you can build up a relationship with a host and sort of tell quite quickly if that conversation is genuine, and build a very trusted relationship with that individual. And I think that's one of the first things that make a podcast very, very different to other forms of media. Also because, podcasts are typically unscripted as well. So it makes it completely different from like a TV or a movie viewing experience. Secondly, as I mentioned earlier, podcasts have an edge over traditional media because of the way that they engage listeners. They're fast moving, they're on demand, and so therefore a listener can listen while they're at the gym, while they're driving, while they're cooking, and doing various other things, which gives it a complete edge over other forms of media. Also, I read a quote recently that described podcasts as almost being like in the black and white era of like how TV was. Because if you think about AR and VR and what those things will do to that medium when they sort of hit the market, you can imagine the future of where podcasting is going. And I think that also makes it super, super interesting. So is starting a podcast easy? Now, that is, of course, the $1 million question. And I think that the answer truly lies within yourself. And it can be as difficult or as easy as you choose to make it. But the number one piece of advice that I have is do not go in blind. Really take the time to research and understand what is the goal ultimately that you want to achieve by starting a podcast. And then figure out who is your target audience. What are the types of things that they would want to hear? And then after that, study your competition. Pay attention to the frequency of their episodes, the length of their episodes. What is their social media like? Who are they inviting onto the show? What are the ways that they're structuring that piece of conversation? Because once you get through that initial hurdle of actually launching your show, which of course is difficult in itself, but then you're on the bandwagon. And that's where the true difficulty is, to stay consistent with pieces of high quality content week in and week out, fleshing things. And, for us at Mission Makers, we decided to go down the route of a season-based format. But we also took 10 months to actually launch the show. We spent 10 months researching, understanding the podcast market, developing our concept, implementing all of the things from recording our episodes before we launched, designing our brand logo, creating the website, all of those very, very important things that you need to do and that you don't want to be finding yourself to be doing once you're actually on the bandwagon, because you realize, oh, I should be having like show notes on my website and I need to now have a journalist, or, I need to think what my social media strategy is. Like all of these things can be way like thought well in advance. And for us, taking that 10 months before launching gave us a crucial head start in laying those foundations and making sure that when we launched, it was like fire. We were just going in and out, week in and week out, and really focusing on the actual behind the scenes, like the back end and all the things that, could go wrong on that perspective, and not thinking about having to record interview guests, not thinking about having to record interviews and coming up with interesting questions. And because we based it on a season-based sort of approach, that also gave us a very, very important sort of opportunity to pause and recalibrate and think about, all the learnings that we took from each season and how we could then step it up for the next season and also use that break to kind of record the next batch of conversations with our guests. And also, in the season break, it is very important to still have content coming out from your channel. But because the beauty of podcasts is that each episode can be repurposed into so many different things, what we did was we took a piece of conversation that was like 60 minutes, and we made that into a bite-sized episode. So during the season break, we just have like recaps and highlights of those very interesting conversations. We put together best of sort of compilations, and we also recorded bonus episodes like the one that you're watching today. So those would be some of my, advice about, is it easy? The answer is it really is on you, because, you can get super creative in the way that your podcast conveys its message. Like suddenly you could find yourself being on the extreme end of the time spectrum. Kind of like us, we spend almost 50 hours producing each episode, but we have a team, behind that. And the thing is when you go down the route of all the bells and whistles, these things take time. Like if you hire a journalist to write the show notes, the time it takes to secure guests, write the interview, create the social media graphics, because we are truly vested in the development and direction of this show. But at the end of the day, you could also take as little as 5 hours if, you only wanted the audio component and you already had like a very powerful system in place. You don't have to be concerned so much about the audience because you already have like a huge audience. So, the time it takes is, again, depending on how much you want to dip your toe in the water. And I think there's an interesting statistic that like there's 2 million shows out there on the podcast universe. But the thing is, only a quarter of those are actually active podcasts. And that I think is because people realize after doing one season or however many episodes that, it is quite difficult to stay consistent. So that's really where, the onus is on you and your brand, and the fact that it's down to you guys to kind of manage that time flow. Like, yes, you can bring in an agency, but ultimately it's your vision, it's your voice, and you do need to be vested in driving that ship. And so therefore, you really need to think like, how many hours can I put into this week in and week out? But the great thing about podcasts is that, the entry barrier levels aren't that high. So you can sort of start rolling with a show. And then, as the show grows, you can start ramping it up and then starting to invest more time, more money, more resources into the growth of the show as your audience and listener base grows. And for sure, your audience will, certainly notice and appreciate when you step up that level of investment. So at Mission Makers, we've actually developed a sort of 5-phase system that we find works for us really, really well, like through each season. Phase 1 takes us 4 weeks, and that's really sort of developing the concept for the season ahead. What are the themes we want to explore? What are the types of conversations and things that we want to highlight? Phase 2 also takes us about 4 weeks, and that's really researching the types of guests that we want and shortlisting them and finding the sort of ways that we can get in touch with those potential guests. And then phase 3 is really implementation. And that is, about a 12-week process where we reach out to agents, we sort of secure our guests, we draft up the interview questions, and then we hit record and we record those, crucial conversations. And then phase 4 is really the launch, 4 weeks, all systems go. Our team is just super, super focused on creating a buzz, for a new season, new guests, fresh ideas, fresh conversations. And then phase 5 is really the growth during that season, which takes, about 4 months. Our season is live. And again, we're just focused on really maximizing the value from each episode and really making sure that our show is on the trajectory of growth, during the time that the season is live. So how do you get into the charts? Another $1 million question, right? And we get asked this question a lot because in a very short space of time, we got a number 1 in our first season, and we charted across many territories around the world. But I truly, truly believe that would not have happened if we hadn't taken those 10 months before to really hone in on our goals and like research our audience and understand, what they wanted to hear and record all of those pieces of conversation, and also learn a lot about the podcast industry and see what our competitors were doing as well. So some of the things that are really important in that is that you need to make sure that there's a lot of content about your show that's being consistently pushed out by the algorithm. And of course, you can control a lot of that internally by having things like show notes, which summarize the episode very nicely on your website, has the sort of transcript attached for SEO purposes. the social media, all of those types of things. And then, of course, very, very important that you leverage your existing networks and that also your guests are also sharing the show as well to create that kind of buzz. And then secondly, my absolute pro tip would be being conscious of who you choose to distribute your show in terms of the platform. And the reason I say this is because you kind of want to hedge your bets. So a lot of platforms don't let you pick more than one genre to have your show be represented by. However, a platform like Acast, which is who we use, lets you pick 3 genres for your show to live in. And so, for example, you could be strategic in picking, like we did, the overall sort of category, which was business, obviously a crowded space, a very big genre in itself. But then we go for like a less crowded space, such as entrepreneurship. And then have a third category as well. So you really have a few different, categories for your show to potentially reach that goal of being in the charts. And then thirdly, your launch strategy is just as important, as the show itself, because you really need the algorithm to work in your favor when you launch the show. So something that a lot of, podcasters who are on the inside, they know that you need to launch with at least 3 episodes on the day of launch. And this is for a very important reason. So imagine that you're a listener and you discover a show, but then the show only has 1 episode. You're less likely to subscribe to that show because you want to know what is the vibe of that show, like who else are they inviting on to talk. So, you really need to kind of have a few pieces of content that not only your listeners can make a decision on whether they're going to subscribe, but also for the algorithm to detect as well. And again, you don't want to be working triple hard to get that listener back on their radar about your show because you haven't got a backlog of content for them to sort of sink their teeth into. But look, at the end of the day, getting into the charts, yes, it's hard, but also it's something that I feel like people shouldn't be too obsessed about because at the end of the day, it's great, it's a tick box and, you can say you've done it, but it's not going to give you that long-term success, right? Like week in, week out, you need to be really, really focused on creating that quality and authentic playground for conversations, creating a place where people come because they truly appreciate your knowledge. All the rest will flow. All the charts, they'll come to you over time. So yeah, that would be, sort of my advice on how to get into the charts. So what equipment should you use to record your show? Now, of course, the number one thing I'm going to say as a music producer and DJ is audio quality. Podcasts are generally an audio-based listening experience. So therefore, your microphone is super, super important. And this is going to be one of your key differentiators. So for example, the mic that I'm using, not the mic in this video, but the mic that I use to record my conversations generally is a Shure SM58. And this is like an industry level standard that many, many pro musicians and podcasters use because it reduces a lot of background noise and it has a very, very nice vocal frequency response. So this makes your voice sound super warm, super high quality, feels like your listeners in the room when they're listening to you in their headphones or speakers. And a mic like this typically costs around £80. So, it's not crazy level, but of course there are much more expensive mics out there as well that you can kind of go down the route of if you're really going, full into investing into your show. And then secondly, with the mic, it's also very handy to have a boom arm that sort of sits on your desk. And, then you don't need to worry about all the other stuff and you can just quickly move in and move out with the boom arm. And I'm using the Rode PSA-1, which also costs you about £100. I'd also recommend as an entry level, the Toner boom arm is very, very good. It's about £30, so it's not too bad. And then you'll need a very nice sort of audio interface to connect the microphone into. So I have a Focusrite Scarlett, which cost me about £100. Again, it's not too expensive, but it really does the job very, very well. If you're recording video for the show, then of course, you really want to have a good camera and not something that's your standard desktop or laptop sort of camera. So I found that the Razer Kio Pro is a very, very nice camera. It just plugs into my USB port, super easy to use, 60 frames per second, 1080p. This set me back about £200. And then if you're editing audio and video, then of course you want to have, professional, high quality grade software. You want to make your life as easy as possible when it comes to sort of editing these pieces of content. So for audio, I would recommend either Logic or Ableton. And for video, then Premiere Pro by Adobe. And then also when it comes to recording your show, of course, having a solid, stable internet connection is absolutely paramount. So make sure you are not hotspotting and you just have a stable internet connection. And then I would recommend using a platform like Riverside FM as opposed to something like Zoom, which is much more entry level. And also with Zoom, the kind of audio sounds a bit tinny and it's not so nice. Whereas something like Riverside FM, it's connected to the cloud. It records your conversations in, full quality. Also, again, your mic helps in that as well. But you can also record in HD quality from your video, and each guest has their own separate audio video channel. You can have like 8 guests, I think, recording in your show. You can even have a producer who's in the room as well. So they're making sure that all the levels are set correctly. And you can sign up for as little as £5 a month. So, it's not going to break the bank. Or you can head down to a super professional studio like this. So shout out to VoxPod Studios in London for a, full-blown bells and whistle experience. So how do you monetize a podcast? And that's also a great question, because ultimately, a podcast in the long term should be paying for itself because of the interest and the lead generation it develops. Because ultimately, podcasts really are a business development tool. You get the chance to have potentially 52 or however many conversations a year with top level industry professionals in your industry, and that in itself is gold. I mean, it's super hard to reach people like that on a day-to-day basis, especially in this current pandemic that we find ourselves in, where we can't be networking and all that stuff. So ultimately, yes, you can't quantify it, but in the end of the day, your podcast could be generating enough revenue through the actual business development leads that you generate that it's totally worth investing in something like having a show. But secondly, the other kind of ways to monetize your podcast, of course, are sponsored ads. I think the industry statistic is something like 65% of listeners actually purchase a product or service that they find out through podcasting. Because again, when you hear an ad on a podcast, generally, because your listeners are quite sort of educated, they're quite loyal, they understand that, you do need sponsorship to kind of drive a lot of shows forward. And also as a host, typically hosts do care about their audience and they want to find products that actually kind of they feel like their audience would find useful and valuable. So, there are a lot of brands out there that have found, sponsoring podcasts is an incredible way to sort of reinforce brand perception and to kind of manage their brand reputation and also, have visibility in a market if a brand themselves are not kind of vested in podcasting. And there are some great platforms out there like Podcorn, for example, which is like a market space for sponsors and shows to kind of meet each other and pitch prospective deals. But of course, again, unless you're super lucky and well connected or whatever, like getting sponsorships is not going to be easy. It's not something that's typically going to happen in season 1. So you do need to have like a long-term sort of outlook and a willingness and patience to wait, because these things, of course, they take time. You need to prove yourself in the marketplace. You need to build up that audience. And then lastly, another way to sort of monetize, and maybe not lastly, but certainly a very crucial way, is also something like Patreon, where, taking away the reliance from a sponsor, but really monetizing your audience. So if your audience really believes in what you're doing, why not set up a Patreon channel and be super creative about the types of rewards that you can give? Don't just give like the usual kind of like $5, get your name on the thing. Like, no, like go in deep. Think about how you guys could like be super creative with your audience and really provide them with value. Like, why do they want to sponsor your show or fund the development of your show? And of course, then, the merchandise and like interesting things like that can also be something that you can monetize your show with. So I hope you guys have found all these tips super useful. I wish you guys all the best of luck in your podcasting journey. It's super exciting. And honestly, I've had so much fun being a podcaster and actually didn't think it would be as exciting as it has become. It's almost become like my own baby, and it's kind of growing and it's maturing, and the kinds of conversation that we've had with people, like never ever thought I'd be able to sit down with some of my industry heroes. Like we've had Carl Cox on the show. We're having a Formula One driver on the show next season. These are absolute dreams, and that in itself is more valuable, more priceless than anything that money could buy. So wish you all the best of luck and take care.